Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography again, Richard Francis Jones. The main interest I'd have in discussing this time around, your second time on Architecture, Design, and Photography here. Welcome back, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've received this second award for the school or the art gallery currently. Which is the most recent one?
The second award, so that was from late last year, is for a public school that we designed, Darlington Public School.
Darlington, yeah.
Yeah, close to the centre of Sydney.
I've spent some time going through your website on that project and the art gallery, and they're both just bright, flowing, light-filled. They look incredibly welcoming and something that you'd want to explore. It's not something that this is a weird thing to me, is they don't seem like projects you can look at immediately and understand. They look like projects that invite you to come and interact with them and explore them in the most positive sense. It's not neither of them seem to be rectilinear, poked holes for window. To me, I'd walk by these buildings and be like, oh, we're going in. Let's go explore and see what they got here, Really, really beautiful projects. But my main interest is this idea of designing for decolonization. And you seem to have a philosophical and focus on this as I would say a driving force behind what you're doing with design and in your firm. And I'd like to hear more about that and get an understanding of the colonization to begin with, and so then we understand decolonization and how that works and how we can approach that through design, that we can practice that and put it into practice through design.
Great. Well, thanks, Trent, and thanks for that introductory comments. I think that question of the threshold in architecture is one that I'm really interested in, and both of those buildings really work hard to make them open, make them inviting, and to open up a whole new world once you step over that threshold. And the question of design for decolonization, I think, is a really complex and challenging issue. And the reason, I guess, it's so central to our work is because we come from a part of the world that has been colonized. Australia was colonized by the British, and like all colonized nations, that had a really big impact on the indigenous First Nations cultures that were occupying the land. And similarly, in New Zealand, now the First Nation cultures are very different in those countries. In Australia, goes back over 40,000 years, and it's not just one nation that was here. There are many Aboriginal nations that occupied this, and had such a deep connection to the land here. And so it's a great challenge for us, I think, as we deal with the impacts that we have had on those cultures, and perhaps move from thinking in an imperialistic way from the 19th and 20th centuries. And then also, I think, simultaneously, as we struggle with some of the issues that face us, particularly in terms of our relationship to the land, the symbiotic relationship that we have with the country that we live, the landscape we occupy, and the way in which we're damaging that landscape. And I think that gives us a certain pause for the way in which we have actually marked and settled and kind of ordered the landscape. And it's not just a question for Australia or New Zealand, of course. It's certainly a question in the United States, in Canada, in South America, Central America. All of these countries have actually been the result of colonization. Or even if we think of Sweden, for example, and some of the European countries and the indigenous cultures there that still exist, the remnants of which still exist. So it's a great challenge for us, I think, culturally, socially, politically, and therefore has an impact on the architecture that we make.
So this is a interesting topic in that I can understand everything through there's two sides to every coin. In Canada, like anytime they have any kind of meeting or anything else on lands that used to be First Nation lands, they'll acknowledge that ahead of time, speak that, but no one's giving it back or getting it off and giving it back to and that just seems so hypocritical, but very kind of, hey, look at me. I don't know what to do with that because, yeah, we're all here and we systematically murdered, poisoned, and gave smallpox blankets to cultures that were here, did horrendous things. And now we have, in some cases, not all obviously, but in some cases, laughable mentions of things that don't change anything, but simply kind of say, I'm sorry you feel that way, and go on about our business. Which, when you interact with someone that's wronged you, and they'll say, I'm sorry I made you feel that way, or I'm sorry you feel that way, and move on, you get this weird kind of like, well, thanks for acknowledging that, but it doesn't change anything. Now, to go back to like these kind of surface level mentions that, you know, like in a Canadian example of people mentioning this before they start a thing. If I was First Nation, and, you know, let's say this whole thing as it is goes on for 1,000 years, and then we, you know, like we forget about everything, and we're First Nation America, First Nation Australia, New Zealand, and an opposing nation gets way more powerful and comes and invades and extinguishes a bunch of us and blah, 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 and we're sitting there, and they're like, hey, sorry about that, you know, we acknowledge that, but we're going to go on with, you know, and you can imagine, is it Russia, China, India that becomes a much more powerful nation 1,000 years from today, you know, whatever. It still just seems like lip service. So how do we actually balance the negative side of colonization? Now, the positive side, is there any positive side to colonization? I'll let you take that so you can get canceled and not me.
Well, look, let me first of all agree with you that words are not enough, right? And particularly words that don't bring with them any consequence. So look, you know, it's the fact that those ceremonies exist. Yeah, something happens, and that you have to see that as positive. But and you know, it's such a complex problem. It's so multifaceted that it's going to require action across such a wide field, both socially, economically, politically, and culturally. You know, not just one of those is going to solve it. And I think it's got to begin with a kind of will to recognize the damage that has occurred. And then there is a process of reconciliation. And it has all of those dimensions, you know, undoubtedly has a political dimension. It requires representation, it requires action, it requires treaty in some instances. And so it's a really difficult one. I think one of the things that I've found most encouraging in my experience, working with First Nation community directly and working with First Nations designers and artists, is that will to reconcile, you know, that and that actually quite a generous spirit around it, you know, the exploration of how can we find a place for these cultures to nestle together, to come together, and in not a damaging way. And that's the thing that I have found actually most inspiring. And I think it's also a recognition that you know, our kind of global modernized culture has had a flattening effect on the culture and the world around us, and it's reached its limits. You know, it's not working in many ways, and we're not feeling too good about it. You know, we're not really feeling a really sense of belonging and attachment and a cohesion that existed prior to the process of modernization. So I think it's also a recognition.
That's a good
We have
point.
this there's this wonderful thing here of amongst in Aboriginal culture about a custodianship of the land, not a ownership of the land, but seeing yourselves as custodians of it, as the need to look after it, foster it, and make sure it's there for future generations. And that's a very different way to think about it as the way we think about it, which is primarily as a resource to be used and potentially used up. And even in that paradigm shift of thinking, we can learn a lot and find a place to meet and look for some form of reconciliation and future together.
That's a very let's see. There's a deeper nuance and a sensitivity to your observation there. That idea of like we've made the whole of society very technologically advanced, and it has a flattening effect of culture, a loss of identity, but an ease of life, and a broader ability for survival for more people. But then a loss of, like you pointed out, a flattening of culture and a disentanglement of what connected us to place in exchange for better productivity, profitability, corporate. It feels corporate. How cars are morphing to essentially the same shape. This kind of hybrid SUV car thing that, all the manufacturers make, and you could just put a different badge on the front. There's no unique, it's just, all right, is it a Toyota, Hyundai, or a Chevy or a Ford that's this, compact hatchback thing? And that's pretty much happened to our culture because of the the multiple shallow levels of connectivity that we experience constantly in our lives, either news, information, programming, communication. It's all very shallow but constant connection. It has this flattening effect that's just not as deep, but it sands all the rough stuff off the top, and we can all survive, but really get by with a lot less meaning these days.
Exactly.
Now,
right.
the flip side of colonization is what we're experiencing, in my opinion. That's the dark side of colonization is, in some ways, if not done properly, or if not acknowledged and approached and attempted to be changed in some way, we're just going to have this continual flattening of culture, involvement in the culture, responsibility to any culture, just kind of a deeper and deeper pull into the individual and the distinct propensities fed by the algorithm, separating us overall over time, and maybe eventually managed by an AI overlord that would be far less emotional and keep everything even. Do we want that future? To some degree, we do. We want everyone to be able to survive, and first and foremost, to be able to survive, but also to not be under duress for being able to survive. But we still, where before colonization or before, before our ancestors came and ransacked over Australia, New Zealand, and North America, and even South America. You don't think of South America as colonized as much, but it certainly is. Anyone that's speaking Spanish in South America is a colonizer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, we get what I mean by that. I don't mean that the people who speak... South America is not a Spanish-speaking place. Spain is. Now it's there. Why? Well... so that, the flip side of that is before colonization, First Nations would chop off the arms, put you on an anthill, cover you in honey, and watch it for fun. There's a flip side to everything. and it was warring, wandering tribes that were more connected to the earth and understood the earth better, probably way better than we do, understood nature and animals and culture and everything within their myopic view of it, and how they use the land, how they would follow the buffalo and everything in the American plains. And then we came in and put metal tracks through and just shot the buffalo for fun because they'd get in the way of the metal tracks. It's insane, but it made a flatter representation of life and survivability for everybody, which is a net good, but we end up in this weird flattened cultural thing. So how do we pull back from the damage that we did to gain this technical, almost mechanical system of us all being able to survive at a better level? The things we get are Monsanto, Pfizer, all of these big companies that provide us everything, that we could possibly want. And, all the cars and communication and food, and we can survive, but, we end up disillusioned and not feeling purposeful or meaningful if that aspect of it goes too far. And then we have these outpourings of weird things like, hey, we're on First Peoples land and great.
Yeah.
See you guys.
Yeah.
We're going to go do what we're going to do anyways.
Yeah.
And it's a bit thin. Now, the positive side of colonization is the ability to live without worrying that there will be a marauding horde of, the town next to us going to come over and, rape and pillage. We don't want that. We've all dealt with that in Europe and everywhere for long enough to where this has happened. But how to undo it? Like if the United States specifically, I think we did an even deeper job of, colonization here to the absolute extermination level, which is just, when you think of it on an individual and a family level, is just haunting how horrible what everything happened was. But
pretty much
if you
broke
think
every treaty that was made, I think.
Oh, what idiot today or ever would have thought that America, from this position, would honor any treaty they ever made? It's insane. So if you wanted to really rectify what we did, but here's another hard thing, like any reparations, how do you do that? Because the people that were affected have intermingled, because kids fall in love no matter your race. And then you get families of mixed race that become a more integrated thing culturally, and is a better thing for a nation overall, that we understand, we all have the same fears, hopes, and dreams and everything else. If we really meant something by undoing what we did, we would say, all right, if you're part of the population that was, drastically lost what you had and, are now sitting in our culture at a under-resourced and unvalued as much level as those who came and look like the colonizers, let's give you 3 generations of tax-free businesses and free education. What's that do? Doesn't take any money from existing people, but it gives insane opportunity to acclimate and achieve and grow within this colonized economy that we've made to equal all that out. Why isn't anyone thinking about that? Because the corporate level doesn't want to see that disruption. They want the individuals to say stupid things at at meetings about, hey, we recognize, and it has no thing behind it. And it's maddening to both get the shame at the same time because I have the skin color of them, but not be able to actually do anything that genuinely helps people at a level that it needs to be done. But you're doing this intentionally with your design, and that's somewhere where this can actually rubber meets the road. And okay, good. What are we doing?
Yeah. And, well, you've covered a lot there, Trent, and I would say 2 things about that. And one is that in confronting this great challenge that we have now, there are kind of two dimensions to it. One, perhaps, is the sense of injustice and inequity that exists around this, which is, well, how can we facilitate a culture that is deeply connected to the land if we've displaced them from the land completely? How can we do this without some steps? And then how can we overcome the imbalance in prison population and education, access to education and opportunity? So there's a sort of social, cultural justice side to that. And then I think another thing which you touched on is that, and I really believe this, that actually fundamentally we are all human beings trying to find a place in the world. And actually we do share more than we differentiate between us. And I think coming from this sort of slightly displaced, modernized Western culture that we come from, where, I wasn't born in this country, and there's a sense of constant agitation and displacement and not feeling connected, right? And feeling individually isolated. Okay, much more enhanced now by our media technology and so on, distracted from this sense of something missing within us. And so I feel that there is actually we've reached the limit of that in a way. All we can do is distract ourselves. If we're going to move forward with that, then we need to actually recover a sense of empathy with the world around us, with the environment, with the land, with the animal life around us. And we need to find a more symbiotic way of living. And that is something we can connect with and build in common with First Nations culture. So I feel there are these two dimensions to it. They're very challenging, they're very difficult. But when it comes to the small things we're doing, we're building a little public school, and we did build a major art gallery, and clearly, if you're building a cultural building in a colonized country, then New Zealand is a bicultural nation, then you really have to step into this territory, and you're either going to do it with openness and sincerity, or you're just going to do it as a consequence of, some sort of just bureaucratic kind of quantitative outcome. You will be saying something either way. And, we're trying to, and I was really touched by the way you started your introduction, because that sense of openness, that sense of engagement, that sense of connecting with the natural world is something we've tried to imbue in the architecture of these two buildings.
Yeah, the thing that's meaningful and the thing that stands a critical thinking test of hypocrisy in what you're doing is that you're in your wheelhouse of where you have effect and ability, and you're aiming at and in as much as you have within your capability in righting wrongs in a meaningful way, I believe. Now that I remember from my youth, I think it was affirmative action was like a political policy in the U.S. and I remember it being contentious because I can remember it from being a child when I had no idea what was going on in the world. But just the ability of being able to see people that look like you in positions of accomplishment and power is very important. It opens up your mind to the possibility of your potential. And if you're a child in a group that is under-resourced and in their native land, but a minority living under, people who have colonized an area, you feel like there's no hope. I can't go anywhere, and so I aim towards the things that can get me ahead in the same manner that I see the people getting ahead that look like the people who are in control of the system. So I would go to higher risk, higher income opportunities, which will usually involve crime, because I don't feel that there's other opportunities open to me. But if I live in a society that acknowledges and portrays me within that culture and honors my culture in their public works and everything else, all of a sudden I feel like, well, maybe I do have a hand in this culture. Maybe I do have a hand in this society. Maybe the art that I draw in my notebook could make it on those walls. Maybe, if I'm inclined to accounting and business stuff, and I see people that look like me doing that as a child, I can see that as a potential for me. But if I don't see that at all, my mind is not open to that possibility, and then I have to rely on extremely unique and strong parental figures that would have enough autonomy to intellectually and emotionally stand on their own outside of their own structure of normalcy. And you see the outliers of parents that, even in a horrible situation can do that grind and really offer a potential to their children, even though the society isn't offering that. But you can't rely on that small number of people to actually change the trajectory of a people or a culture. And like you're doing, accepting a responsibility in the part in which you can create, says, look, I see the injustice, I see the wrong, and I'll do what I can to right that. And that's in a realistic and rubber meets the road type of way, and it shows just aesthetically. It's a more open, more welcoming. It's inviting you in, so that this kind of leads into things I've been.
You're absolutely right about that, and that the school that we designed, 25% of the children in that school are Aboriginal kids. Same with the teachers. That's a very, very high proportion. And we have a First Nations architect designer working with us, and he when he came and had a look at that school, he after he had been around that school, he said to me, "Alkais, I really wish I had been to this school when I was a kid. That honours my culture, that makes me feel like I have a place." That, he said, what a difference, what a journey. He's been on an individual journey, and it's not easy, but it just reminded me of it, that point you're making. And a lot of effort goes into making a school like that, a lot of patience, a lot of listening, a lot of learning on our side, but it can make a big difference for the children to see that there is a place for them, that their culture is honoured, that it's respected, that it's celebrated, that it's sitting integrated within a Western culture, that these things don't need to be in conflict, that they can actually be in a symbiotic relationship. Those things make a big impression on children, and I think, and can help support, the efforts that parents and guardians and friends and family are making.
Yeah, the societal change over time is something that's been exaggeratedly slow in our history, but with our technology now, our desires and accomplishments as humans move faster and faster, and we trample over culture and people. And in that, we have to, the people who are able to navel gaze, the people who are the ones that suffer from constant ideas, have the responsibility for taking those eccentricities that allow us to be creative, allow us to use ideas and put them into practice and realize them within reality, but are also resourced enough to do that. There's a responsibility on us to speak up when we see the thing that is wrong, no matter the culture, team, city, nation, whatever it lands in. I think there's always going to be a higher calling to what's true, and an ability or a calling to admit what ability you have within writing that, or what contribution you made towards upholding that, or helping it continue to victimize people. Now, in saying that, at the same time, you and I can look at native cultures and see or First Nations cultures, and that would apply to any country, I would imagine. It could apply to England, Russia, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, America. Any country that's been there long enough so their culture is marinated in that land and in that nation. I mean, hundreds and centuries, of time passes, and when is someone considered to be from an area? When is their culture enough of an outpouring of that geographic region that they are considered, okay, First Nation? Is this only people out of Africa, or what is it, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that some people think civilization started there? So over time, I think people meld to a land and become part of or an extension of that land, no matter their race. But as we've gained technology, that's allowed us to leave the land that we were part of and to go and take other people's land. And, when we did too much on our land and we're too uncomfortable and we're bumping up to people too much, like rats in a test, like New York City, if they're too close and they're too packed in, they start biting each other and it all falls apart. If they're not too packed in, they get along fine. And, so with technology, we're able to colonize. And it's, the nations that had development of technology that would then go and slave trade and colonize. And that, I think, first and foremost, probably happened in African nations and in Middle Eastern nations. That the word slave comes from Slav, which was, enslaving Yugoslavian peoples or Slavic peoples. So that we have this propensity over time, but now we have had technology at a heightened level long enough to where we're able to introspect about it and have a chance with the capabilities we have to, instead of hopefully not descending back into chaos, but we have the ability to, okay, we've gotten to this point, we have enough technology to make things even for everybody and to flourish culturally together. That's the only way it happens. And in the constant separating and demonizing of one or the other is unfair. Each culture, each race has done their own fair share of evil, and we all have a part in correcting that. And that's the thing what I see with what you're doing, I cannot find fault with it, and it's inspirational because of the realization of, all right, we have this idea of technology that we can utilize. We have design, we have culture, we have geography, and we have history. How do we bring these all together in an intersection point that has the best outcome for everybody involved, while giving specific emphasis to those who are underserved, who have been, in many ways victimized, even though that word is quite charged lately and misused. But cultures have been victimized, but every single culture that's been or has been victimized at some point in itself did the exact same thing. No one's got blood-free hands in this scenario. If we want to paint a demon, it's easiest to paint the demon who's currently the most resourced, and you always punch up, you don't punch down. I get that. But I think, being of the part of society, the resource part that architects find themselves in, is maybe one or two echelons down from, those who control the world to a degree, but you're still at a point where you have massive influence and an ability to influence and direct culture in a way through the aesthetic representation of our cities and buildings to be more inclusive, to be more mindful, to be more even-handed, fair with the environment and the environment of the society and culture and races involved. And, give window space, a massive window space for the culture that evolved out of the land there in New Zealand. And those shapes and those aesthetics and those drawings came from the people interacting with that land. You know, the Maori tattoos and all of the aesthetic and the way of living came from a people being mated to the land. And, you know, as colonizers, something was brought that added a level of equality overall now, but there's still quite a dispersion of wealth and influence and ability that's still there that needs to be righted, and this is the work of doing that. Sorry, I'm just kind of thinking through the whole process in my head and what hope and ability there is, while recognizing that what you're doing is on the track of influence and ability that you actually have within your control, and that's pretty inspiring and inspiring and awakening to see, and that you can actually have people in very influential places that are genuinely exerting that influence towards a better end. And
you know, it's interesting, Trent. I'll give you an example of when I was first working on the art gallery in Auckland, and it was a real experience
wood structures overhead are just
those
so
tree-like structures. Yeah,
beautiful. Yeah, love those.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, they used the timber that we've used there is really important and very special. It's called kari, and it's you know, it means a great deal to Maori people. They would instantly recognise it, and it's also a protected species, so we couldn't actually cut it down. We had to find either reused kari or naturally fallen trees in the forest. But probably the most enlightening thing that happened to me on that journey of helping to make that building was early on, when I was in a meeting, a bunch of people in this meeting, very important meeting about the project. And you know, in our Western culture, we tend to think about our processes of getting from A to B quickly, being on budget, building this much staff, it's got to get done, all of these sorts of things. It's all about very ends-driven process. And in this meeting, there was a Maori elder, Sir Hugh Kaharu, and he had a lot of presence, you know, and he didn't say a lot. And then at one point, he really commanded the room, and he wasn't that interested in all of those things. He wasn't really interested in the ends. He was interested in where the journey we were going to go on together and the spirit that we were going to bring to it. And I remember him, you know, speaking, and I say he had a really commanding presence, you know, and he spoke at a very high level. And he said to me, you know, he looked directly at me personally, and he said, you know, why are you here? You know, why are you here, and what are you going to do? And it wasn't a question about how much is it going to cost, how much are you going to build it, when are you going to finish it. It was a personal question about why I was in that room and why I was going to do this project. And you know, it was it was a very I took that really sincerely, you know, and really tried to live up, I think, and answer that question in the work. And we wouldn't engage with each other that way in our culture. You know, we wouldn't ask those questions, but they are probably the most important questions to ask.
Yeah. What's your business plan? Can I see it? What's the percentage rate? And okay, it's profitable.
That's right.
Then I will greenlight it.
That's right.
So my dad's he worked as a pastor and a church administrator for his career, and he was in the northwest portion of New York, Syracuse area. And let's see, there's Onondaga. There's a few different native nations represented there that have lands, and they there was churches that were in those nations that he serviced and worked as administration for, and occasionally he would be adjacent to some of their tribal meetings. Their native nations and clans would come together. I believe, I could be getting a lot of this wrong because I'm recounting it, and I didn't live it. And even when I do live things, I get them wrong. But they would have meetings in a longhouse that only the members of the tribe could be in. There'd be no outsiders in that. But in their way that they would determine the future of their nation, the different tribes would come together, and they would have smaller groups that would discuss the issue, but each of those groups had to have members from the different tribes represented in each smaller group. And each of those smaller groups then, as a single representation of the mix of the people in that group, I believe, had a vote in whatever they were talking about deciding. And so they, as different clans, had to come together, work together for the future of this, whatever decision or whatever is being made. And they had to have representatives from different clans working together to make a representational vote per, these different groups. They'd break out, they'd discuss it, but the final word for each group would be done by a clan mother. And I thought there was a lot of, wisdom in that knowing the stereotypical difference in propensities between men and women. Men will often charge forward. They will often, to the advantage of the immediate, try and secure something because of their propensity to provide and survive, primarily, more so than a more longer thinking of being able to relate and stay in community. They'll be like, I got to provide for me, then I got to provide for the family, and then I got to provide. And so there's testosterone and all that at play, but the last word being spoken by a clan mother who's gone through life and has raised her own family and knows the trajectory of life as a representative for each one. There's a very thoughtful, inclusive, and diverse representation of thought process and decision making within that community that is very different than what seems to be a corporate or developer mindset. In our current culture, who are the people that are making decisions and moving forward? There's church boards and school boards and stuff like that, but for the most part, the movers and shakers are in these larger entities of corporations, development, and the things that control the lifeblood of modern culture. And those decisions are not made with long-term strategy. There's a investment level that each quarter you've got to show profit. There's this single marker of success, and primarily, too often, it comes down to, is this profitable? So it's a profit-driven thought process rather than a societal, cultural, custodian of geography, earth, and nation, and more so profit. And I think, in seeing what the direction that design is going and what you're doing with design, I think there's a realization of how the pendulum has gone too far one way, obviously, and we're trying to bring that back the other way. It's interesting to see the cultural flare-ups of people saying, hey, you're demonizing white people or colonizer. There's always going to be these, no matter what you try and do with change, who's ever in the position to lose the most with this change will always speak up and have some offense or be offended that they're being associated with anything to do with it, but it's
inevitable.
road.
Yeah, and that's it's the problem with difference, and it's easy to demonize difference. and yet it's also something we've got to recognise, and that's why I think, as far as possible, if we can actually create a kind of cohesion, if we can create some form of reconciliation, if we can bring these things closer to all of us, right, then that starts to overcome the difference. Because if your kids are in the same school as kids, a whole bunch of Aboriginal kids, if that becomes a normal part of life, right, if it's not, then it becomes much harder to blame difference, to, attribute that blame to somewhere else and say, my problems are due to these people, my problems are due to the fact that we're putting state funding into this, or,
Right.
This is, if we can actually overcome, in a way, we need to do two things simultaneously. We need to reach out and understand and respect a culture that is different to ours, and yet at the same time, we've got to be able to hold it close so that it can become familiar. And that's a way in which, even in a little school, we're trying to do that. It's not just us that are trying to do it, of course. It's also the community that are trying to do it. The teachers are trying to do it. The parents, the kids. It's but we're in there, and we're trying to bring these things together, not to actually pull them apart, but to try and find a place that you can find that space of just being there in a way that is not confrontational, that's not unjust, that's equitable, and a table upon which people can place things, and that's a step. And I think you start to, the more that the broader community can understand that value and understand that history and not see it as threatening, that will then gradually start to change community expectations. And if there's one thing that the corporate world does respond to, is that, of course, they'll inevitably try to manipulate it through, advertising and communications and distortions. But nevertheless, community changes in attitudes and values do have a big effect on the corporate world. Inevitably responds to it. We even see that now in terms of issues of environmental sustainability. We can see, there are corporations that are not just responding to that, but actually, in a sense, leading it. It's not just simply good and bad.
Yeah, with the nature of our modern society, it seems like our vote is more within how we spend our money than how we actually vote.
Yep. I would say that's more powerful. Yeah.
In thinking that way, like, oh, this corporation is making these choices, well, I'll choose not to support them. But then, corporations are hidden under layers and layers and layers of ownership and everything else, and you don't know who you're and what you're doing. So there's complexity. But there's something I was going to say that was fitting before I had that brain fart. But sorry.
Look, it is complex, and it is hard, and I think it is easy to become overwhelmed at the scale of the problem, and I think the way in which so much of humanity responds to it. And that's why, I think perhaps lowering your horizon a little bit, framing it in, doing something which can have a positive impact, makes a difference.
Right.
Anything
in
you can
the
do to make a
area where
difference,
you
right?
have ability and influence. I think one of the difficult things about our modern culture is we can see far too much, and we feel that we have to have an effect on what we can see. And we see everything now, just everything. Whatever happens in New Zealand that's newsworthy, I'll see it within 5 minutes if I need to. It's insane how our, human animal has come to drink out of the fire hose of information and what it's doing to us emotionally and culturally. All of a sudden, we all need to all of a sudden be of the stalwart nature of someone who's a world leader who can take all the information and make effective choices. But we're not that way. And we just kind of get all the information and crumble in fear to some degree. Like, then we're kind of like, forget this, I'm going to go look at reels forever and get some dopamine feedback, and we overload on that.
That's right.
And then I used to get to the place where I'd had enough. I had had enough media, and it's like I felt like there was like a perception of being mentally full, and I just can't do this anymore. And
Yeah.
there'd be no dopamine when I'd see and look at things where there was before. And I finally had to brick my phone when it, better existence, but I'm harder to get a hold of now and a little bit more aloof. But hey, I'm a little happier and maybe a little more towards Finnish First Nation, what I would have been had my ancestors stay put. But yeah,
Well, that's that sense of more direct, meaningful, rather than quantitative communication, I think is really important, Trent. And going back to that conversation, that question that Hugh Kaharu asked me, that Maori elder who asked me that question, but my answer was that I'm here to listen. I'm here to listen, and that I think is for an architect, for a designer, that's probably the most important skill that you have to acquire. And if you're going to listen, you have to put aside a whole lot of preconceptions and genuinely listen. And it's not a passive act. You've got to really want to be there, and you've got to listen. There's some, I don't know what that statistic is, I can't quite remember it now, but it's most people that you're talking to they stop listening to you when the person's halfway through because they're thinking about what they're going to say.
And especially hosting a podcast, it is so hard to not, because you constantly feel like you're running towards a cliff, and it's in listening that you're speaking, and that cliff ends when you stop talking, and I've got to, it's like, when he stops, I gotta. But it's also a thing that's difficult for a certain personality type, because if you're an architect or anyone who's of a certain ilk, you suffer with constant ideas. And those constant ideas, I don't know if all architects are this way, but I would imagine those constant ideas block incoming information sometimes.
Totally.
For a good part. And it's hard to everything that you say sparks an idea, and that little spark runs off and starts a forest fire over there, and then it runs off and it starts a forest fire over there, and I'm like
absolutely right. It's a hard thing to do, and the thing about listening, I think, is that you can't be afraid of some silence.
That's hard.
You haven't got to fill all the space, and as you say, these are not things that we're almost trained against it. It's and in the modern, in the contemporary world, as you're saying, you actually have to take positive action to create a bit of space, to create a little bit of silence, and to create a space to listen. You have to close this stuff off, shut it down for a little bit, make it hard to access. It's no longer a kind of receptive act. You've got to actually be positive. You've got to take some action to create that space.
The ability to shut it all off, slow down, and listen either to someone you're with or to your surroundings. I find being drastically introverted that I can thrive in one-on-one conversations, and I really enjoy my time alone in silence. But again, that time alone in silence is usually me listening to all the torrent of ideas going through my head that I'm trying to all right, you're not useful, you are useful, you are, but that the people with the ideas are good at coming up with solutions for problems, but you're not going to see the most important problems if you can't train yourself to actually listen and have already solved all your own pressing problems. It's kind of like how a culture doesn't develop art until they develop sustainable food, shelter, and protection. Art doesn't, creative stuff doesn't really happen as much, or expression doesn't happen as much when you're in that environment. Now, with our current culture of phones and everything else, it's almost as in you're at a mental fair. Or amusement park. It's a constant distraction, constantly begging you to pick me up, scroll through me, and let me distract you and take your attention. I mean, our attention span has been commoditized, and that's oh, here we go. We've colonized the mental space. We need to decolonize the mental space. Where just as we spread out into lands and colonized them for our personal gain, currently as humans, we're having our mental, social, emotional, spiritual space colonized by this kind of stuff. And I know that could be an offensive, flat lack of understanding of people who've actually experienced physical, geographic colonization. This is not what I'm saying, and I'm not diminishing that. What I am saying is all of us, every single one of us that chooses to operate in this modern society has to go through the colonization of your mental, emotional, spiritual space by the things that you interact through. Because every single thing there is a commodity with a profit motive, and the best way to get to that profit motive is by captivating your attention span. And that will take away from your spiritual space, your relational space, your mental space, your cultural space, your actual physical geographic space will become more diminished and less important. You'll retreat into this, and you'll be captivated and utilized as a piece of profit. That's what it is. And
your identity,
that's the modern
in fact,
stage of it.
Yeah, your identity is commodified
Flattened,
in
like
that process as well.
Yeah. It's happening at all levels, but I really appreciate that you and the level that you have the greatest influence are recognizing and putting your, all the torrent of ideas that I'm sure you struggle with to good use, to listening, and then, to develop all right, here's the space for listening to actually do effective, real good in where I have my responsibility, my ability to make change towards a more equitable distribution of life and ability and success and sustainability wherever you're at. And being in nations like New Zealand, Australia, and North America and South America, but South America is less accomplished at this point, so it doesn't introspect as easily. South America has a more difficult, they're not as successful across the board as nations, and so they don't, maybe they don't introspect and worry about this as much because just survival is more important at the time, whereas these three of New Zealand, Australia, and America, survival, our problem is overweight, not underweight, So we have this ability now to say, hey, maybe we've gone too far in this, trampling over everything that had meaning previously to just be able to survive. It's kind of like when you get to the north here in Maine, in our state, you start to see the architecture as it gets to less resourced areas, less financially supported areas. You can see in the reflection of the architecture that it's primarily cost effective and get warm and dry quick. So you've got trailers, back in the woods. It's winter's coming. What are you going to do? So
there's an essential quality to it, right?
Yeah. It's utilitarian far more so. And there's not a lot of thought towards beauty and place as much as surviving. But yeah, that idea of how do we correct what we've done is work at the forefront of these most modernized nations. And imagine where culture is more monochromatic, like India and China, what the conversation around these kind of things are. India experienced massive amounts of colonization, but then said, hey, let's not have that anymore. And they're poised to be an absolute superpower coming up. So that's, Sorry, I'll wander all over the place mentally if you don't rein me in a little bit.
Well,
It's
I think
interesting stuff.
yeah, yeah, and I think what we're doing is small steps, really. They're limited
Yep.
in the effects that they can have,
Hmm.
and I think in each of them, the process of making these buildings, the spirit in which they're made, is actually as important as the outcome.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and is essential to the outcome. And I think it's a bit like I was alluding to before. There's a lot to learn in going through these experiences, and in starting to change a kind of rational, Western, kind of modernist way of thinking and paradigm around how you make a building,
Mm.
and to try and adjust that slightly through the process. It's not easy to do, but if you're going to make buildings that actually are going to achieve some kind of steps towards reconciliation, then you're going to have to change the process as well, even just a little bit, at a time. And that's also an exciting thing. I think that's an exciting thing for us more broadly, socially, in our industries, to think, can we rein in a bit? Ironically, can we slow it down a little bit? And that's
Our profit-driven society speed
yeah,
is
yeah,
massive,
that's right.
and if that
Yeah.
keeps distorting our reality, we go faster than we can evolve to survive. We're running right into AI, and we don't know what we're getting into, which is just an unknown. But we have to admit that it is insanely powerful, which means it's unloading something from us that the weight of that thing strengthened us. Whatever it is that we're offloading with AI, there's a weight that we carried in what we would have done previous to be offloading that weight onto AI that will weaken us in that we're not carrying that anymore. And that's an interesting thing. But we wouldn't get rid of the use of the wheel. That allowed us to carry a lot more. So there's two sides to every coin here. That'll be interesting. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
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 Well, Richard, thank you so much for helping me think through these things by trying to pay attention and listen to someone else's stuff that they've done really well. And that's, as you pointed out, it's a good exercise to try and shut up and listen for a while, which is really hard for me to do. I am a classic interrupter and talker over. But this is very good. And again, it's so it's inspiring to see someone working at change and betterment of society in very intentionally, not just profit motive. Now, in saying that, is there anywhere other than aesthetics within these projects that is serving to diminish or is serving to decolonize? Beyond the aesthetic and the layout and the things that are on the wall, the art that's brought in is there any philosophical thing within the school, within the building practices, within the finance, and all the rest of the things that go into it other than what you can design in as far as look, feel, and use of and process within? Is there a process within this schooling that is accommodating a different approach to education that is less of a colonization kind of like every kid gets taught the exact same way because that's the most effective for factory work, or
Look, that's a great question. And, the school that we've designed is a public school. And therefore, it needs to respond to the public education model and brief that works across the state of New South Wales. But we did have the opportunity to slightly adjust and develop that educational model. And we were also able to create spaces which weren't anticipated in that brief. And so there's this curvilinear form, which sits behind this perforated metal screen. That was actually evolved out of the circulation space, and that is a space into which all the classrooms open out through these big sliding doors, and it looks out into the garden space. And that becomes a really important teaching space, which is kind of more organic, less structured, and less determined. And it also flows into the external space. And these sorts of spaces are inherently more comfortable for First Nations cultural use, to be more connected with the outside, to not be shut in a box, to be able to experience the fresh air, to also be able to sit under a tree and talk and learn and exchange knowledge. That slightly destructuring of the educational model, of not having people all sit in rows or sit in boxes. So we have pushed that, and we did that with the help of the school itself. And then in terms of the process behind it, again, it's very difficult when one's working within the structure of public education and development. We've got budgets to meet, we've got programs to meet. We had to build half the school and then move the kids into that. They stayed on site the whole time because that saved us a lot of money.
All right.
We've got to work with all of those things. At the same time, we were able to spend time with the kids, time with the teachers, and we listened to what they had to say. It was quite interesting when we talked to the children and got lists of what they wanted. And one of the things that they said they wanted was they wanted a piece of country. Right? A piece of country being, and countries, the term we use here for the land understood in a First Nations perspective, right? That it has a life in itself. And that was we were really mindful of that, and various other things they asked us for. Like they asked us for a jumping castle, which we couldn't give them.
Like the inflatable bouncy ones?
Yeah, that's right. It was hilarious, right? But it's lovely working with children. It's really, they're so insightful, they're so direct, they're so uninhibited. So, it can be a really joyous experience. So, look, Trent, it's sort of edges, it's little pieces we can do here. But funnily enough, some of those small things, can make quite a big difference. We got no more money for it than in any other school. We're on strict budgets, all those sorts of things. But I do think it goes back to what we were talking about before. I really do believe it's listening afresh, and then trying to find that in the work, and make those desires, I think, and aspirations visible in some way.
Yeah,
and experiential.
It's a difficult process to work with your own ego when serving others, because you're going to want to be recognized as doing good, and that's you'd rely on your own ideas more naturally. It's a discipline to say, all right, my skills and everything else need to be in the background to serve the primary objective. The primary objective, and especially hard as an architect, because I know from practicing for a little while as an architect how difficult the practice is. And the people that succeed generally have enough ego to get through that difficulty. And that ego will serve you really well in surviving, but it will also then trample over everyone who doesn't have as much ego. And so to find someone who's been intelligent enough to put their ego in check, but also have the ability to use something that they could use to glorify themselves, instead pointed at helping others, is always that kind of switch that is so admirable and inspirational. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Trent. It's always, I remember the last time we spoke, and it was really enjoyable, and this has also been a really terrific discussion, unlike any other interview or discussion I have, so I've really appreciated it.
Well, I basically do no prep work and try and get as close to the line as being not confrontational, but I really think there's always two sides to everything that you do, and it's important to look at both sides and to acknowledge both sides. I think in the same way that Christian mentality would say that we're all sinners, rather than in the best painting. I think Christian culture is one that says we're all sinners, rather than you're a sinner, And it's just, we have this ability, we have this technology. How do we guide it? How do we continue to develop? How do we continue to design, working towards an even playing field for all involved? And the thing that I keep thinking is the best thing to do is to identify what is it that is keeping us from being able to be more equitable and have a thriving success to life for as many people as possible involved. And that's the deeper profit channels and motivations that have that are harder to find, and harder to redirect. Anytime there's a profit channel in a certain way, it's very hard to redirect that. It's just built into that system that everyone who survives on it doesn't want to not survive if that profit channel's there. It's no different when we have all the, a government agency make sure they spend their entire budget, because if they don't, they won't get as much budget next year. So it's just in human nature, and what you're doing goes kind of against human nature. Let's take our ability and use it to help others. This is a good thing. Again. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure it's probably pretty late where you're at. So
it's getting late.
Thank you.
A pleasure, Trent. I really appreciate the perspective and also the breadth of the discussion, which I think is essential to these issues. So great talking to you.